Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We are continuing our discussion of American history since 1945. Last week we were talking, in my last lecture, I was talking a bit about the origins of the Cold War, and this time we're going to talk about the escalation of the Cold War. And in doing so, I want to talk about a couple of events that kind of built upon each other to create a broader crisis than had existed even in the late 1940s. I'm not going to go into too much detail about these events. You've got a whole bunch of readings that can talk about the specific events, so I'm not going to go into detail. I just want to give you a very high-level overview of the big picture of what's happening with American foreign policy, with the Cold War, successes, failures, that kind of thing. And I'm going to basically tell a story in two parts here. One is the kind of a brief description of the Red Scare that was developing in the 1950s and where it comes from. And then I'm going to talk about kind of the story of American interventions around the world. You may remember, hopefully, from last week, things like the Truman Doctrine, really, and the NSC 68, those types of things really set the United States up for intervening around the world. But all of that intervention is coming as a result of fear. And I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the ideological results of that fear in my next video, which will be posted soon also. So, first off, let's talk a little bit about this Red Scare. Where did it come from? Now, when we left off last time, we had talked about some very dramatic failures in this new American containment policy. 1949, in September, the Soviets lit off their first atomic bomb. And then about a week later, at the beginning of October, China, this civil war in China, ended with a communist victory. And so, from the perspective of the United States, the country with the largest landmass on the planet, which is the Soviet Union, and the country with the largest population on the planet, which is China, both of those are now communist. That doesn't bode well for us, the United States, if it is our job to contain communism and possibly roll it back around the world. And so, wow, that's a crushing blow. And this is one of the things that really motivates the creation of this Red Scare that I'm talking about. And then, of course, there's Korea, which comes right on the heels. Those two other events happened in 1949. The following year, the communist North Koreans invaded, it's not really capitalistic South Korea, but U.S.-friendly South Korea. And as we can see on this map here, very quickly, those forces almost got all the way and almost conquered the entire country of South Korea. There's this little kind of circular area down here at the bottom where the South Koreans were finally able to dig in. They started screaming for American help and the UN's help, and so the Americans land behind the enemy lines here at Incheon, and that turns the tide. And so we, being the UN and the United States and the South Koreans, managed to turn the tide, push the North Koreans back, and almost conquer North Korea until the Chinese troops come across the border because they're scared that, a conquest of North Korea could threaten Chinese stability. So the Korean War, at the end of it, they reached this stalemate line, which is pretty much the same line that existed before the war, but the existence of this Korean War, this massive attack from North Korea into South Korea, which almost destroyed South Korea, almost conquered South Korea, another thing that's kind of adding to American anxiety, because wow, that was a spectacular failure of containment. We almost lost an ally there. We managed to push back and we managed to reinstate the status quo, but wow, that was a close one. And so, again, Americans are getting very nervous here. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that people start wondering about why are we losing all of these things? Why did we lose the atomic? We didn't, lose the atomic bomb, but how did that happen? How did they get the atomic bomb? How did China fall to the communists? How did Korea almost turn into a disaster? Hopefully it's not too hard to guess that a lot of people are going to start trying to jump to conclusions and thinking, well, you know what, maybe there's something going on. Maybe there's some people within the United States that are working against us. Maybe there's some kind of conspiracy happening where we, the Americans, are being held back somehow. Americans, since the very beginning of the revolutionary times, Americans have always been a very conspiracy-minded people, and we can talk about that another time if you like, but In the Cold War, there is a kind of a sense that, the Americans, we are supposed to be the most powerful country on the planet. We're the one that survived the World War II intact. We had the first atomic bomb. How can we be losing if we're not being betrayed from within? Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's kind of just like, the Germans at the end of World War I, the whole stab in the back type thing. Thankfully, the United States didn't take it to the same extreme that the Germans did after World War I, but it's a similar kind of conspiratorial mindset that something happened that's preventing us from doing what we need to do. It's preventing us from doing what we want to do. So, it shouldn't be too surprising that some Americans are going to start looking for that conspiracy. They're going to start trying to dig up the bad guys that have infiltrated the United States and are causing these failures. So you've got people like Richard Nixon in the House of Representatives and later in the U.S. Senate, he's one of the members of the House On-American Activities Committee in the 1950s. Of course, you've got Joseph McCarthy in the U.S. Senate kind of leading the fight against communism. He's famously made his name by holding up a list of 107, or maybe it was 95, or maybe it was some other number, a list of what he said were communists working for the U.S. government. And those communists were, hobbling the U.S. government. They were, to use a modern term, they were the deep state that were embedded in the American government that were somehow thwarting American successes around the world. And so Joseph McCarthy dedicated his brief political career to rooting out those enemy agents that had infiltrated the United States. So we've got politicians, we've got other people trying to root out communists in the United States because they are the enemy. They are subverting from within, sabotaging from within. So we need to purge them. And so it became this became a very popular message. These were a couple of ads from the 1950s. Scott Paper Towels, of all people, is your washroom breeding Bolsheviks? What? I mean, I don't know what the connection between, toilet paper and paper towels and Bolshevism is, but, this was kind of an example of people jumping on that anti-communist bandwagon. You'd want to show that you are properly American, that you are patriotic, and that you're not going to support the enemy. You've got Radio Free Europe, which is an American-financed radio station that's broadcasting into Eastern Europe. It's broadcasting anti-Soviet propaganda. So on the right here, we've got this advertisement for how can you contribute to that effort to try to sabotage communism in Eastern Europe. Because, the communists are sabotaging us here. Let's go sabotage it over there. So we can do that through supporting Radio Free Europe. Sometimes it goes to a little weirder extremes. This is the Bone Aluminum and Brass Corporation. These are a couple of ads that they posted in the 1950s where they seem to kind of take it upon themselves to educate the public about the evils of communism. So on the left, we've got communism wears a false face. The hard, vicious face of communism hides behind a mask of peace. It's a clever masquerade to throw free people off guard. It's a typical technique in the Kremlin crusade to dominate the world. Over on the right, another one. It looked safe, but it was a deadly poison. A dose of socialism can be just as deadly. It kills freedom, leads to communism. Would you risk a little poison? Buy Bone Aluminum Brass. I don't know. They've also got a television show, the American Forum of the Air, every Sunday night at NBC. So check your listings. It might still be on. But this is demonstrating that, popular culture is kind of embracing this anti-communist crusade. Movies. I Married a Communist, starring Lorraine Day, Robert Ryan, John Agar. Her beauty served a mob of terror whose one mission is to destroy. Now, I've never seen this movie, and I read the Wikipedia summary of it, and it sounds confusing as all get out. I don't understand what it was, but, He Married a Communist, that was the central point of it. Communists are bad. Communists disrupt everything. So, we've got popular culture kind of jumping on the anti-communist bandwagon. You've got popular, corporations. Besides, there was the Bone, Brass, and Aluminum Corporation. Here's the Oldsmobile kind of embracing this new modern technological era with the rocket engine and a brilliant new body. This one's not explicitly anti-communist, but it's certainly adopting a lot of the weaponry. Missiles were kind of the new fad, and rockets and all of that, and they were the new, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. But there's this sense that the world is changing. It's more space space age. And so Oldsmobile wants to get in on that. There was even a massive confrontation, strangely enough, between Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev over which country supplies the best appliances to their citizens. The United States, there was this forum in the United States in 1959 where Khrushchev and a bunch of other Soviet delegates came over, and Richard Nixon took them to this display of appliances to demonstrate how well the American, homemaker has it in the United States because they have all these amazing appliances. Khrushchev just kind of chuckled and said that no, life is better in the Soviet Union. So this became, a very minor confrontation as these two bickered about appliances, but it's an interesting moment when both sides are finding things to argue about in new areas of life that no one would have expected before. Now, all those failures of communism that I was just talking about led the new American president, Eisenhower, who took office in 1953, to look for a new way to try to prevent those failures. And in the old days, back in the Truman years, the containment hadn't seemed to work all that well. Containment, which had been kind of premised on the idea that we will pay money to countries to try to put down communist threats, dedicating maybe manpower. There was kind of a mushy version of containment from Eisenhower's perspective. And so when he came into office, he wants to create a new vision for containment that's going to go through the 1950s and into the 1960s. And he called it a new look at containment. And the policy that he decided on was this policy of massive retaliation, which meant that we are going to beef up our supply of nuclear weapons. By this point, we've got the hydrogen bomb. It's pretty much ready to roll out just as Eisenhower is coming into office. And so he's going to put a lot of his attention towards building a nuclear deterrent, a nuclear response to Soviet aggression, with the idea that if we build up a big, massive pile of nuclear weapons, the Soviets will not engage in any type of activity that might anger us. And so the massive retaliation is the idea that we're going to create missiles, we're going to create bombers that can drop nuclear weapons, we're going to really build up our nuclear arsenal so that we can deter and hopefully contain the Soviets because of maybe they'll be fearful of the threat of nuclear annihilation. And so this chart here, you can hit pause on the recording if you want to look at this. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but you can see how quickly the United States beefed up its stockpile of nuclear weapons. 1945, we were at 2. Those are the ones that we dropped on Japan in 1945. But very quickly, you can see in the 1950s, 1960s, this blue line is going up very, very quickly. So when Ike took office in 1953, there were just over 1,100 nuclear weapons in the American arsenal. By the time he left office 8 years later, we were up to 22,000. And the numbers are going to increase until 1967. But under Eisenhower, the American nuclear arsenal, skyrocketed very quickly, and it's going to stay pretty high until we get into the 1970s, 1980s, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a couple of weeks. But it will go down. But for now, we're focusing on this upswing here. Now, the Soviet response is in the red line here. Soviets were way behind the curve when it came to the United States. When Eisenhower was talking about, we're fearful, we need to beef up the nuclear capability because the Soviets were keeping pace, that was a lie. Everybody knew it was a lie. You just couldn't say that was a lie because in the Cold War rhetoric, you have to be strong on communism and all that. So nobody was actually going to come out and say, no, we don't really have to worry because look how far behind the Soviets are. And the American intelligence agencies were good enough to know just how far behind the Soviets were. And so this was actually well known. So the Soviets aren't going to even catch up to the United States until the U.S. is actually on the downslide, and that's going to be in the late 1970s. Now, in the 80s, the Soviets are actually going, because they're still building, they're actually going to be kind of up here, and they're actually going to get more overall than the United States even at its peak, but then very quickly the Soviet arsenal is going to collapse also in the wake of the end of the Cold War. So anyway, so Ike wants to contain communism through overpowering nuclear weapons and the construction of military bases around the planet. The Soviets, of course, responded in kind, and that's going to lead to some crises that we'll talk about very briefly here. Now, at the same time that Ike is building up this massive nuclear arsenal to deter the Soviets from expanding their sphere of influence, he also settles on this policy where we're going to do what he's going to call covert containment. The overt containment, that's the nuclear weapons. That's in your face. Big mushroom cloud, big missiles, big missile silos. That's in the Soviets' face. They have satellite, eventually they'll get satellites where they can see it. They've got spy planes flying overhead, so the Soviets can see that in action. Ike's also going to pursue covert containment, though, where we're going to try to go under the radar to create change in other places around the world. The Truman Doctrine had called for big showy interventions. We're going to throw a whole lot of money at Greece and Turkey to try to stop the communist aggression. Here, we're going to try to work behind the scenes. The Central Intelligence Agency suddenly became a major player in international relations because Truman would charge the CIA with finding ways to quietly overthrow unfriendly regimes around the world. And the first test of that came in Iran during Ike's first year in office. In Iran, a new president was elected, Mohammad Mossadegh, and Mossadegh had talked about nationalizing the Iranian oil industry. Nationalizing it means the Iranian government would take it over and seize all of the assets from the oil corporations that were in operation in Iran before this time. Now, the oil corporations, of course, were siphoning all the profits out of Iran. There were very few of that money, few of those profits going to the actual Iranians. And Mossadegh got elected on this campaign promise that he would change that. By nationalizing the oil industry, Iran would get to keep all those oil profits, and the Western corporations would all get kicked out. The Western corporations, of course, screamed to high heaven. They talked to the British government, they talked to the American government, and Eisenhower decided to charge the CIA with figuring out how to solve this problem. The CIA solved it by sending a couple guys over to Iran with a couple suitcases full of cash. They start talking to military leaders over there, and they start offering money to the Iranian military if they rise up in a coup to overthrow Mossadegh and restore the long vacant monarch to Iran, the Shah Pahlavi family. And so they did that. The Iranian military rose up. They overthrew Mossadegh. He got assassinated at the airport, I believe, in Tehran. And the Shah was put into place. And the Shah, of course, was much friendlier to those Western oil corporations and did not appropriate any of their property and did not nationalize any of the oil industry. This is going to come back to bite the U.S. in 1979, of course, when the Iranian Revolution will put in place a whole new generation of extremists who were very unhappy with the United States. But we'll talk more about that later. But from the perspective of 1953, this was a smashing success. Again, it just took a couple of guys and a couple suitcases of money. Everything worked out just fine. Same thing happened in Guatemala the following year. In Guatemala, it wasn't oil, it was fruit. The United Fruit Company, which is today known as Chiquita, the United Fruit Company owned most of Central America and had converted much of that land to the production of fruit, like especially bananas. This is where the term Banana Republic comes from. Those bananas were valuable to the Chiquita, or the United Fruit Company, but they were not valuable to the people in Central America. So the Guatemalans in 1954 elected a guy who ran on a campaign saying that he would appropriate land from the Fruit Corporation and redistribute that land to the Guatemalans, who had previously been frozen out of owning any of that land. And he worked. He got elected. The United Fruit Company screamed to high heaven to the American government. This looked like communism. We're going to seize all this privately owned land and distribute it to the people. That looks like communism, just like seizing all the oil and distributing the profits to all the people. That looked like communism in Iran. And so the CIA replicated the Iran situation. A couple of guys with suitcases of cash. They got the military to rise up, overthrow this guy Arbenz, who was the new leader of Guatemala. He died, and a new military government took effect that was much more friendly to the United Fruit Company and the United States. So again, a smashing success. It was relatively cheap, didn't cost any lives, or at least not any American lives, and got it done, got the job done, what Eisenhower and the American administration wanted to happen. So, covert containment looks like it's working pretty well. Yeah, there's still some failures out there. Sputnik is a huge failure. Many of you, some of you have been talking about Sputnik in the various discussion boards and all that, but Sputnik was a disheartening failure. And Sputnik was terrifying for a number of reasons. I mean, one, there was just, all Sputnik was this metal basketball-sized satellite with these antennae on it, and all it did was it transmitted a ping every couple of seconds, so it would just go by in the sky and go bing, 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 which scared the bejesus out of everybody for a few reasons. I mean, from the kind of the average American perspective, wow, there's this thing flying overhead. Is it taking pictures of us? Is it going to drop a bomb on us? What is it going to do? From the scientific perspective, this is terrifying because what this means is that the Soviet Union was able to draw an X in the sky, launch a rocket, and hit that little spot in the sky. And that's difficult to do. I mean, I can't launch anything into orbit. I mean, you put too much power, it just flies off into space. You don't put enough power, it falls back to Earth. Basically, they figured out a way to put a man-made object into a position in space where it can then circle the Earth. It doesn't take too much more thinking to think, wow, maybe they can draw an imaginary X on Washington, D.C., launch something from Moscow, and have it land in Washington, D.C. That would be very, very bad in this era of nuclear weapons and all of that. So Sputnik was terrifying to the United States. And it prompted Americans to start beefing up their scientific endeavors. We're going to start launching our own Sputniks. This is in 1954. 3 years later, they launched Sputnik 2, which houses a dog, the first living thing that goes up into space and back. The Soviets had a big, when Sputnik 2 landed, the Soviets had this big parade and put Laika up on a stage. Unfortunately, Laika actually had died in that Sputnik 2 trip, and so the Laika that showed up in the parades was a fake Laika. But anyway, but again, they put something up into orbit, and then they brought it back down. The creature inside didn't survive, but we brought it back down. A few years later, they sent one up with a human, Yuri Gagarin, who did survive coming back, and so he became the first man in space. And so it really looked to the Americans that the Soviets were really leapfrogging past us technologically. And that's terrifying, because wow, if they conquer space, that's like the last frontier, if you think of Star Wars? Star Trek? Whatever. This is the last frontier. And so that's going to be serious trouble if the Soviets get there first. Because if they militarize it and we can't exploit it, that's going to be a problem in the long run. So the space program is a smashing failure from the American perspective. Eventually we catch up and surpass them and go to the moon in 1969 before they do. But it's still terrifying. And a demonstration that the Soviets can get their act together and they can do amazing things if they want to. This is the American response, the red conquest, the meaning to the world, why we're lagging. Some of the most obvious responses to this was the Americans boosted university spending, which is why there was a whole lot of universities built in the 1950s and 1960s, because the American government wanted to foster physics research, astronomy research, scientific research, and so they heavily funded American universities to do that, which is why the college students of that era basically got to go to college for free because the American government was funding it almost completely. Those days have passed. So, a few other incidents that caused turmoil. In 1960, an American U-2 spy plane got shot down over the Soviet Union, which is going to cause a lot of heartburn. Because the Soviets are going to get very, very angry that the Americans are launching spy planes over the Soviet airspace. The Americans are going to try to pretend that it wasn't an actual spy plane. But the Soviets ended up producing the pilot and put him on trial. And it all comes out, yes, he was piloting a spy plane over the Soviet Union, which is going to create a bit of a crisis with the Soviets. When John F. Kennedy came into office the year after the spy plane was shot down, in his first State of the Union address, As he put it, each day the crises multiply, each day their solutions grow more difficult, each day we draw nearer the hour of maximum danger as weapons spread and hostile forces grow stronger. We are moving into a period of uncertain risk and great commitment in which both the military and diplomatic possibilities require a free world force so powerful as to make any aggression clearly futile. So JFK is amping up the rhetoric in this growing, escalating conflict with the Soviet Union. Because now there's, a plane just got shot down. That's dangerous. And then the Americans decide to pick on a Soviet ally. In 1959, the Cuban government fell to a revolution from within. The revolution from within had been partially supported by the Soviet Union for, long detailed reasons. The Americans didn't like this new communist government that took power in Cuba, and so the Americans decided to launch one of those CIA campaigns that had worked so well in Iran and Guatemala. They decided to try this again in Cuba. So just after JFK took office, the CIA presented him with another one of those types of plans where we're going to drop, in this case, we're going to send in a bunch of locals that are heavily armed, along with some suitcases of cash and some American spies to try to topple this new communist government in Cuba. As we all know, the Bay of Pigs invasion, as it came to be called, was a rousing failure. It was a rousing success for the Cubans, for Castro and his government, but it was a demoralizing failure for the United States because that covert containment system had failed. We thought it was working so well, and it did not. So Kennedy's going to put some effort into creating other types of engagement with the rest of the world. The Peace Corps, the Alliance for Progress, these became non-military efforts to have Americans go out into the world to try to persuade locals in other countries to embrace the American side of the Cold War and reject the Soviet side of the Cold War. They do a lot of other stuff, a lot of really cool stuff like building hospitals and building schools and all that, which is really awesome. But one of their purposes, of course, also is to spread American values, spread American influence, and try to change people's minds around the world when it comes to the American versus Soviet Cold War. So this stuff is happening. There's some literal containment happening in Berlin in 1961 when the Soviets build a wall around West Berlin. The wall was not meant to contain people in West Berlin, or it was not meant to allow, it's not there to block West Berlin people from getting into East Berlin. The purpose of the wall is to prevent people from East Berlin from getting into West Berlin, because the Soviets had a huge brain drain problem in Berlin because a lot of people didn't like living under Soviet rule, and so a lot of people would jump over the line into West Berlin, and once they get to West Berlin, they're free of Soviet influence. West Berlin is controlled by, up through the 1940s, it was controlled by France, Britain, and the United States. And once they all merged together into one nation, that nation was free. And so as long as someone could jump over the line, they were going to be free. And so we've got this is one image of it here. A mother in East Berlin passing her baby to her husband who was in West Berlin. And as long as you can get across this imaginary line, or in this case, this barbed wire line, you're free. And in this case, so theoretically, the child got to West Berlin and was free. I don't know whatever happened to the mother here. This picture was, I don't know the context of this story, but it's an interesting thing. The families were split up by the creation of this wall and all of that. So we've got the Soviets performing some version of containment also, but their containment is to try to keep people from fleeing the East into the West. And then the big one, the biggest escalation of them all, of course, came when the Americans found Soviet nuclear facilities being built in Cuba. After the failed Bay of Pigs, of course, Castro had requested help from the Soviets to make sure the Americans never tried to invade again. The Soviets agreed and started to place missiles in Cuba to try to dissuade American intervention there. The Americans found those missiles and got very, very upset. These are CIA photos from U-2s that flew over Cuba in late 1962, and they found all these fuel trailers and tents and all of that that demonstrated that they were in the process of building some really heavy nuclear facilities. These facilities, from the Soviet perspective, this was fair game because the Americans had been building missiles around the Soviet Union for years. There were a whole bunch of these missiles called Jupiter missiles that were placed in Turkey in the late 1950s that were the same exact situation. The Americans looking to create a deterrent for Soviet expansion by placing missiles in countries around the Soviet Union. The Soviets think, hey, fair game, let's do that in Cuba also. The Americans, of course, don't respond well to this development. They don't respond well to missiles in Cuba. As this map on the right is showing, those missiles could very easily reach the American homeland, and there are different types of missiles: short range, medium range, and long range, and even the medium range could hit Washington, D.C. and most of the populated eastern seaboard. The longer range missiles that were getting installed in Cuba could reach all the way to San Francisco. And so most of the United States would be under threat of nuclear attack from those missiles. And so this became a very overt version of containment because Kennedy went on TV, announced to the world what was going on, announced a blockade to contain Cuba, to prevent missiles and missile technology from getting to Cuba. The blockade works. The Soviets eventually back down, and the Americans are triumphant at the end of what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this prompted Americans to kind of get a little bit cocky again. Because again, this was in a long-term, kind of the long run of covert and overt operations against hostile powers. Again, going back to it worked in Iran, it worked in Guatemala. It didn't work in Cuba the first time. It kind of worked in Cuba the second time. I mean, the Americans had to agree at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis not to invade Cuba ever again, but Cuba was kind of removed from, the table, so to speak. Cuba was no longer much of a problem because the Soviets agreed not to put missiles there anymore. The Americans agreed never to invade, but Cuba's just going to kind of be, pushed aside on the international stage from that point on. The Americans come out of it, though, thinking, wow, you know what? We yelled at the Soviets, we went eye to eye, and the Soviets blinked. So maybe going forward during the Kennedy years and even onward, maybe we just need to be more overt about our engagements around the world. Maybe we just need to push back harder. We need to go in with more overwhelming bluster and overwhelming force. And that's going to lead to tragedy because in the Kennedy administration, when a new crisis develops in Southeast Asia, in the country of Vietnam, that's going to lead to a whole bunch of heartburn and heartache that we're going to talk about in another time. So containment worked in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Americans started to think, yeah, we can probably do that in other places around the world too, like in Vietnam. And that's, as I said, that's going to end up being pretty tragic. So, thank you, and we will pick up again next time, and until then, take care, and happy history? I don't know if that catchphrase works, but anyway, take care, we'll talk again soon.